Okay, Mayor Seaman, we're ready to open up the meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the special meeting for public hearing on the water and sewer rate adoption. Zoom is a wonderful, it's a wonderful tool for a lot of things, but not the best for facilitating meetings. However, I really wanted to open up the meeting because I think that tonight's topic is so important that it was important that I make my presence known, but for the sake of creating an efficient meeting for the rest of the evening, I'm going to pass my facilitating duties over to Mayor Pro Tem Burgell. And that way I think things will just move more smoothly. I will be here on Zoom if you have any questions or if I have any questions. So Mayor Pro Tem Burgell, thank you for helping me out again.
You're welcome. So can we have a roll call, please?
Mayor Seaman,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Burgell,
Here.
Councilmember Castellano,
Here.
Councilmember Moulton,
Here.
Councilmember Arroyo,
Here.
Councilmember Bauer.
Here.
Okay. So moving on to the public hearing on water and sewer rates adoption. Can we have a report, Director Issa? Director Gerving?
Good evening, Mayor Seaman, Mayor Pro Tem Burgell, and members of the council. So we're here before you this evening with a recommendation to adopt the most recent rate study for water and sewer charges and adopt the fee schedule, or adopt the fees that would come after that. We were last before you on November 15th, where staff gave a presentation about where we were in the Proposition 218 process, having notified property owners and customers of these proposed rate increases. Those notices, as Jordan Taylor from NBS will go into, were mailed out on October 31st, and we're out for a period of at least 45 days before today's hearing in compliance with state law. So, like I said, we're here before you recommending adoption of those rates. That Jordan will go into a lot more detail, why the rate increases are necessary, what the study entailed, how the cost of service was analyzed, and ultimately what the rates are. She'll also go into some of the driving factors like aging infrastructure, a consent decree having to do with a lawsuit that's really accelerating our schedule for a lot of wastewater projects, lack of grant funding that's available to the city in a lot of areas. And what it comes down to is a lot of deferred maintenance that continues to pile up. And, the can was kicked down the road for a number of decades. And with the last rate study and this one, we're now playing a game of catch up. So Deputy Director Issa and I are on hand here in council chambers to answer questions on behalf of Public Works, as is City Engineer Jesse Willer. Director Millar is downstairs available by Zoom. And with that, I will hand it off to Jordan Taylor from NBS for the bulk of the presentation. I will note there's probably a blank in the presentation about the number of protest letters that have been received. And as of right now, that number stands at 296. They're here in council chambers with us if anyone wants to look at them. That number includes all of the letters that have been received, not just those that have been determined to be valid. So without doing that check, the number could be somewhat smaller, but 296 is the overall number.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you, Director Gerving. My name is Jordan Taylor. I'm a consultant with NBS. We were hired on to help out here with your rate study. I have about a 20-minute presentation I'd like to show you guys. I think most of it will be something that you've already seen, but please feel free to ask questions along the way. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, is everyone able to see the presentation cover slide?
Yes.
Excellent.
Online as well.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so the overview tonight, we're going to go over the approach approach and methodology of the study, explain the financial plan, cost of service, and rate design. Then we're going to talk about both the water and sewer utilities and their bill impacts, and then talk about the next steps after tonight. So our approach is based on a 3-step process. All of this is from industry standard manuals, including the American Water Works Manual M1 and the Water Environment Federation Manual Practice 27. These are very industry standard books, and you'll see them all across rate studies across the state. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of each of them, but first we look at the financial plan. And this compares current sources and uses of funds and determines the amount of revenue needed to be collected from rates. Once we have that net revenue requirement, we go into the cost of service analysis. And this is where we proportionately allocate all of the expenses across your customer classes. This is what will help you comply with Prop 218. And then finally, we look at the rate design analysis, and this considers what rate structure best fits the city's needs. This will look at the percentage amount of fixed versus variable that we're going to be collecting from your rates. All right, so if we look at the financial plan, like I said earlier, it estimates the rate revenue requirement. And what this means is we include your operating and maintenance expenses, your debt service, any planned pay-as-you-go capital projects, and make sure that we reach our target fund balances. The calculation is really simple for this. You just take the O&M plus your debt service plus your capital minus your non-rate revenues. So those are your late fees and any other fees that may not be directly correlated with the utility fees or charges. So why do we need to increase these rates? Director Gerving mentioned a couple of things that are driving these rate increases. A big one is your capital expenses over the next 5 years. Your water utility is looking at more than $23 million in expected CIP costs. We are assuming a $6 million SRF loan to pay for the AMR project. And it's notable to mention that water purchases account for approximately 50% of the O&M budget, and those purchases are unavoidable. Your sewer utility has more than 29 million in expected CIP costs over the next 5 years. And there's a big upgrade to the wastewater treatment plant in the works. Humboldt Community Services District is responsible for 32.1% of treatment plant capital. But also, like Director Gerving mentioned, the lawsuit has accelerated the CIP timeline. So all of these together are driving the need for rate increases in both utilities. All right, so the cost of service allocates your costs across your customers. And we first allocate the cost to certain parameters. So for both utilities, we look at customer costs. Those are your billing related expenses, admin related expenses, etc. Also your flow related costs. So this is the amount of water that's being used and or put into the system from both utilities. For water, we look at your capacity related costs or your fixed costs in your system. And for sewer, we look at your strengths. So your chemical oxygen demand and total suspended solids. Those are what's being treated in the treatment plant. Once we have those parameters all organized, we allocate your cost to your customers based on their contribution to the plant. And this contribution is found from your billing statistics. All right, for your rate design, we want to have a few goals in mind. First and foremost, it needs to follow your cost of service, which means it's equitable and non-discriminating. this is what will follow your Prop 218 requirements. We want it to be easy to administer and easy for both staff and your customers to understand. And of course, we want to make sure that the utilities have some revenue stability. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the water utility. So as mentioned a few slides back, the capital improvement program is rising each year for water, and it is the largest driver for your rate increases. So this is what it's looking like over the next 5 years in graphical form, and it is trending upwards. All right, I realize this slide is a little busy, so I'll explain it a bit. This is your sources and uses of water funds, and basically the calculation as to how we come up with your net revenue requirement, which is at the bottom line. If you look at the first gray line, that shows what your deficiency will be without rate increases. So as you can see, by the end of year 5, you're looking at a 4.1 deficit, 4.1 million deficit. So after rate increases, that number starts to smooth out and you are starting to see a surplus again. Now for the water utility, we are proposing 10% increases in the first 4 years, followed by an 8% increase in the last year of the rate study. Now, it's notable to mention that this 10% increase is to the revenue requirement, not necessarily the rates in the first year because of the cost of service. So here is a graphical representation of the last slide. So the bars represent your expenses, with the blue bar being your O&M expenses, your operating expenses. The red portion is your debt service, your current debt service. The green is your rate funded capital expenses, where the yellow is your reserve funded capital expenses. So when you're going to be tapping into your reserves. And like I mentioned earlier, the water purchases account for about 3.4 million of your O&M expenses. So nearly half of your O&M expenses are unavoidable. All right, and if we're looking at cash now, your bars represent your operating and capital reserve balances, and the green line represents your minimum target reserve balance. So overall, the cash flow is looking pretty healthy. There are a few years where you won't quite hit it, but right after the 5-year rate period, you are expected to hit that reserve target again for the water utility. All right, so this is the resulting cost of service analysis for water. So about 66% of your costs are capacity related, fixed costs. About 31% are your commodity or flow related costs, and 3% for your customer related costs. So this is what's going to be allocated across your customer classes. All right, so finally we arrive at our proposed rates, and I won't spend too much time going over this because I realize it's a pretty busy slide, but for single family residential customers on their fixed service charge, we're looking at about $30.28 currently to $34.11 proposed, with the volumetric charges for all customers inside to go from $2.64 to $2.75. And then we have the rest of the meter sizes and customer classes on this table as well. All right, so if we're going to look at a bill comparison for our single family residential customers, this is what we're looking at across multiple consumption levels. So your x-axis here represents your monthly water consumption, and the y-axis is the dollar amount for the monthly bill. So the average monthly bill is 5,500 cubic feet used per month, which will look at going from $44.80 to $49.24. And where your lower users will go up by just under $4, and your higher users will go up by just under $6 or so. All right, let's jump into the sewer utility now. So here is the capital improvement program costs for sewer. And again, they're trending upwards, and they are the biggest driver for your rate increases in the sewer utility as well. And here is the summary of sources and uses of funds and your net revenue requirements. So just like water, your deficit before your rate increases is anywhere between 800,000 roughly to 2.3 million, where with the proposed rate increases, you're looking at a surplus almost every year of the 5-year rate period. For sewer, we're proposing a 10% increase the first year, followed by an 8% increase in the next year, and 4% increases in the last 3 years of the Prop 218 period. And lastly, the last line here is what your net revenue requirement, anywhere from 10.6 million to 13 million. And here again is the graphical representation of the previous slide. The same format here, your bars are your expenses and the lines are the rates. So the solid black line is where your rates are currently, where the dotted line is where our proposed rates are looking to put us. Again, the blue is your O&M expenses, the red your debt, and the green your capital expenses. Now, if we're looking at the cash for sewer, again, it's pretty healthy. We're going to be dipping into the reserves a bit at the beginning, but hitting our minimum target reserve balance in the last 2 years of the rate period. The resulting cost of service analysis for sewer, we're looking at 51.1% is volumetric based, 22.9% in the strength, BOD, and TSS, and 3.1% in customer costs. And these are what's going to be spread over your customer classes. Here are the proposed rates for sewer. It is notable to mention we are proposing removing the 2 units of free water because it is difficult to justify why. So that's probably the biggest change here. We're also absorbing the monthly account charge into the monthly fixed charge. So you will not see a separate line item on your bill for that anymore. So for single family residential fixed service charges, we're looking at an increase from $24.34 to $27.60, with your volumetric rate going from $9.15 to $6.47 per 100 cubic feet. All right, for a bill comparison here, it's set up very similarly to the water. About 4.700 cubic feet is your average monthly consumption. And so again, across the x-axis, you've got your consumption levels from 0 to 11 and your monthly bill along the y-axis. So your average monthly bill for a single family residential home is looking like it will go from $51.92 to $58.01. All right, if we want to look at our regional bill comparisons, this is for a total of both water and wastewater. Eureka is currently at about $95.27 and is proposing to go up to $107.81, which compared to the surrounding agencies is really right in the middle of it. So we're looking like we're pretty comparable on the positive side here. All right, for our next steps, like Director Gerving noticed or said earlier, we sent the notices to customers and property owners on October 31st. We had the 45-day period and now are in the public hearing, which is tonight's meeting. And if there are no majority protests, that's 50% plus one, the new rates can be adopted. All right, and now I'll go ahead and open up for questions and answers.
Do we have any questions from council? Councilmember Arroyo?
Thank you. That was a very helpful presentation. When I hear the terms, I've been doing this long enough that I kind of know the ropes. But when I hear the terms revenue and surplus, and I imagine when other people hear them, they might think that means we're making money that could go towards other things potentially. And so I wonder if staff could explain how the reserve is utilized and why we want to have a reserve in those particular funds.
That's a good question. I should rephrase by saying that is actually the contribution, maybe not so much a surplus, more a contribution to your reserve funds.
Thank you, Councilmember Arroyo. So from a broad overview standpoint, both the water and wastewater enterprises function as enterprise funds. That means that the revenues have to cover the expenditures. And in the case of both of those funds, we also need to maintain a certain amount of reserves so that we can fund unplanned expenditures. We can cover cash flow from month to month. If you're interested in more detail in that, Director Millar could probably cover it better. But basically, each one of those has to stand as its own business and, have sufficient funds for something unforeseen. We don't subsidize the general fund with water and wastewater. We don't pay for, parks or new streets with water or wastewater funds. It's solely just the operations and the capital expenditures necessary for those utilities to operate.
Thank you. I have some other questions, but I'll share the airtime.
Councilmember Castellano?
Oh, sure. No hurry. But I am, clearly, I don't imagine anyone loves raising water and sewer rates. So just a couple of questions about that. Do you foresee that there might be grants that become available for some of these infrastructure improvements that need to happen that we could, like let's say you found a grant for infrastructure improvements, would we reduce rates or like how might that be factored in? I realize none have been identified thus far, so here we are. And then also, would it be possible to, raise the rates more slowly over a longer period of time?
So the first question, if there are grant opportunities that come up that we're not currently seeing out there, a lot of the programs from the infrastructure bill at the federal level have not yet made it down through the state and to local jurisdictions. Is there something there that might be an option? Potentially. What that would do is, in all likelihood, potentially in future fiscal years, the council could decide to reduce the amount of the increases that are forecasted right now. What could also happen is that would get ironed out in the next rate study. Reserve balances would potentially be higher, assuming capital costs stay where we anticipate them right now. Then potentially reserve balances could be higher, which would lessen the impact with future rate studies. What we've seen over the past 5 years and prior to that is that unfortunately capital expenditures continue to come in higher than we've anticipated, even when accounting for inflation. So we don't know that that would be what actually happens, but it is a possibility. Could the council decide to raise rates more slowly over a longer period of time? Proposition 218 and the rate study process mandates that be studied for 5 years maximum. So while that could be a plan and an idea, it's not something that could be voted on right now. It's not something that could be adopted as a study right now. We can only do that for 5 years at a time.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bauer?
Director Gerving, I know in the O&M cost for water, 50% basically pays to buy the water. Mm-hmm. Is that a function of a lack of users? So if we had a bunch of pulp mills, right? And I think I'm answering my own question, but would the rates be lower if we had more users into the system? I mean, I think we have this huge amount of infrastructure that supported a ton of mills and all kinds of industry. So it's gone up because of that, right?
In part, for sure. Okay. Yeah. Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District, that the city and other municipalities locally purchase our water from, they have a system they need to maintain just like we all do. And they have customers to pass those costs on to, just like we do. In our case, we're one of those big customers. They do have a small set of retail customers as well, both residential and industrial or commercial. But most of their revenue at this point is coming from their municipal customers. So the city, HCSD, MCSD, Arcata, Blue Lake, Fieldbrook, and Manila. And it's not like they're out there spending gangbusters doing unnecessary projects. Just like us, they're actively seeking grant funding, and they do a really good job, particularly with hazard mitigation grant funding from the feds. So it's just one of those cases where the costs are what they are. They're passing their costs on to us as one of their primary customers. And in the case of Humboldt Bay, Eureka is the largest municipal customer with the largest share of those costs.
Thank you.
Councilmember Arroyo?
Am I allowed to talk about something that's going to come before the council from our participatory budgeting session? I think the answer is no, but I'm still going to ask if I could bring it up.
I think that your instincts are good on this. Without a fuller understanding of what you're going to talk about, I can't give you a complex legal opinion, but best to err on the side of caution here and stick to the agendized item.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know there's potentially something that could help, but it's not going to come before the council till the next meeting, at least. Is it going to come in December or in January?
It'd be the first meeting in January. Okay.
So in January, there may be something helpful to this discussion that I can't talk about right now because, I think that's fair to say. Okay. We discussed a utility. I'll just say we discussed a utility assistance program, and you will have a choice about whether to adopt something like that from the participatory budgeting session to avoid being really weird and vague. Okay. So that's not a question. I apologize. This is my last meeting, so fire me. So I do, on a more serious note, for the benefit of everyone here tonight and everybody watching, could you explain a little bit about Prop 218 and what restrictions that entails? Because I know that this is something that has evolved and become more stringent. So could you share a little bit about that?
I would be glad to let the city attorney answer that question.
Yeah, well, I think that Jordan did a very good job of laying out the procedural requirements that the city has followed here for 218. starting with ensuring that we're in the right lane, the 218 lane, rather than requiring that we go out and ask the public in a ballot measure to vote on this in that way. And so the 218 process is a special process, right? We're allowed to send out notice, have people send in letters in accordance with that notice, and essentially cast their vote via letter versus, on a single day as a typical election might happen. And so that's a unique process. That's the one that we're following now. And we're following that process because, again, as Jordan pointed out, these are fees that are specifically going to pay for the service that's provided. It's not a special tax.
And the term fair and the terms fair and equitable in this context, I know we have in the past been asked to consider things like a senior discount or special programs for folks who are on a fixed income, that kind of thing. So is there something about Prop 218 that means that we can't do that? Or is there some other reason why we basically have to charge everyone based on their customer class?
Yeah, I think it's because there's a complicated calculation that goes on, which is the reason why we have a consultant that we've hired here to ensure that their rubric, their methodology means that they have fairly allocated the fees in alignment with what is common in the industry and in accordance with state law. So we hire them. They're the experts on that particular piece, and we trust that they've done that job. And so, we're not at this point going to fuss with it by adding to or taking away from, because it may change the calculation totally. We can't do that on the fly and ensure that we're still complying with 218.
Mayor Seaman?
Following up with Councilmember Castellano's question about being able to lengthen the amount of time that people pay for things back. So Prop 218 means we have to do it within this 5 years. We can't next year extend it to 5 years, and then next year it has to be the next time the study is done, right?
Well, there is the possibility of redoing a new rate study sooner than the end of that 5-year period. But you can't do the opposite. So, for example, Arcata had to do a new rate study after 3 years, I think, into their 5-year period because they had a lot of unanticipated costs having to do with more wastewater work at their treatment plant, just like we're facing. And so they moved that new rate study forward for a new 5-year period. What you can't do is extend it beyond 5 years. We have not encountered a situation where we've had to accelerate the schedule and bring a new rate study before council sooner than 5 years, and we don't anticipate that need here either.
So I actually have a quick question. So could you explain, so no one wants to see their water rates or their sewer rates go up $7 to $14 a month. No one wants to see that. No one wants to experience that. However, if we were to vote no on this, what would happen?
Right. So like we had in the presentation there, a large part of what is driving these rate increases are capital expenditures. So improving our infrastructure, maintaining our infrastructure so that it complies with state law, so that it is serviceable and continues to provide water to our customers and to treat the wastewater safely, make sure that what we're discharging is safe and good for the environment. If we were not to enact these rates or adopt some rate structure that is less than this, then the two alternatives would be either don't incur those same capital expenditures, which in most cases is not a feasible option. Certainly in the case of wastewater, with the regulations that we're facing and the consent decree that we've entered into with the Ecological Rights Foundation, those are non-negotiable items. And on the water side, just from the standpoint of ensuring that we can safely deliver good, clean water to our customers, it's also non-negotiable. So then it would be looking at where do those reserve balances fall, when do they go negative, and where would that money instead have to come from? And at some point, and it's a pretty short timeline, the reserves would get depleted, meaning that we don't have those funds to cover cash flow for unanticipated emergency costs. And then we would need to find some other source for those funds. In that case, it would probably be the general fund, and it would mean pretty drastic cuts in services when you look at the scale of the water and sewer operations as compared to the general fund operations.
Thanks for clarifying that. Councilmember Arroyo?
I know that there are some limitations with this, but I still wonder, so people are paying potentially a lower volumetric rate with our new study. Was my understanding that the cost for service, the fixed cost would be higher, but the volumetric rate would be a little bit lower. Is that accurate?
Jordan, would you mind covering that one? I think that's the case for sewer, but not for water.
I'm thinking about sewer specifically. Sorry, sewer specifically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we did in sewer is we actually implemented a extra heavy customer class. So those extra heavy customer classes would be your breweries. They just discharge a lot into the system that makes it really difficult to treat. So they're putting a lot of strain on the system. And previously, the low, medium, high commercial customers, single family residential, multifamily residential, they were essentially footing the bill a little bit on that because they were being charged at the heavy rate. And so we created this additional class to make it more fair across the board.
Okay, so based on the idea that that wasn't my main question, but it's very helpful to have that clarification, and I hope it'll be helpful for others. So thinking about decreasing the volume, it's not the most enormous cost savings for people, but if there's a possibility of encouraging gray water usage for residential customers, where essentially people can divert sink or washing water to, for example, water, non-edible landscaping, things like that, that could reduce the strain on our plant and the volume that people are sending away and being charged for. Do you see any possibility to do that as part of this next suite of changes as we move forward?
Because that's something that's not contemplated in this study, I don't want to venture too much of a guess. I think that there has been a greater ability for folks to do gray water systems in recent changes to the plumbing code at the state level. How widely that's happened within the city, I don't know. But if there turns out to be a greater number of folks, of customers that choose to take that opportunity, then we could look in the future at how we might be able to quantify how much less water they're putting into the system. Right now, for the vast majority of our customers and for all of our residential customers, the sewer is based on how much water the customer is using. There are a few larger commercial and industrial customers who have meters on their sewer effluent, but for our residential customers, that's not a practical approach. So in the future, we could look at that, but we'd have to figure out a methodology for how to quantify what is going down the drain.
And just to clarify, I don't think it's going to be enough people to really factor it into the rate study anytime soon. But I do wonder about encouraging people, because I do know that the plumbing code became more supportive of gray water systems. And so I wonder about encouraging people and providing that information. Like, would Public Works do that? Or is there a place where people can come and find information about how to essentially divert some of their water that would be going to the sanitary sewer system to gray water instead?
I think even just from a water conservation standpoint, oftentimes that gray water is used for irrigation of certain types of in certain situations. And I think that it does help from a water conservation standpoint, and we can absolutely work with development services to make sure that information is out there for people who are interested.
Councilmember Castellano.
Okay, few questions. Let's see. You showed a comparison to other communities after 1 year. I'm curious if, we probably don't know how every community's rates are going to change, but was there any analysis done of a comparison of our rates to communities after 5 years?
So we don't have that information this evening. What I will say is that most often you see that those kind of, especially recently with rate studies being done on a regular basis with costs increasing for everybody, it's kind of a leapfrog game in reality. Usually the highest utility will drop in the rankings somewhat, and there'll be a little bit of leapfrogging. But what that graph that Ms. Taylor showed indicates is that Eureka is not somewhere off in left field compared to other agencies locally. And we always try to give the qualifier that everybody's capital needs are different. Everybody's operational needs are different. So we certainly wouldn't begrudge Rio Del because their rates are the highest. They have different needs for their system, and that's just how the rates worked out in their case.
Thanks. And then I think this one is probably a question for Director Millar. Are we anticipating any reserves in the general fund over the next 5 years that could be used to kind of help offset the CIP improvements?
I haven't made an analysis that would look at something like that. My guess is that it would be hard to achieve the proper reserve levels in the general fund while also funding street improvement projects and then adding monies for utilities. I don't know if we could extend the general fund out that far, but it's a question that I can answer after some time, so I could come back to that item.
Okay. And it's something, just to follow up on that, like, let's say in a year we're seeing reserves in general funds. At that point, would we need to do another water rate study if let's say we're like, okay, we have some millions or what, and we want to put it towards water and sewer improvements, that we could then make those adjustments at that time? And would we have to do another study in order to do so, or could we look at the numbers we need and do it in that way?
So I'll try to answer that one. I think if basically what's before council tonight, what the rate study has documented, these are the highest rates that can be adopted. It's what staff is recommending. So council could not decide to adopt rates that are higher by any amount. But council could choose to adopt rates that are lower by some amount, either through deciding to fund fewer capital expenditures or by choosing to subsidize water or wastewater with general fund monies, which, as Director Millar indicated, are not there to the extent that would be necessary. But council could vote to adopt lower rates, but not higher. That would also mean that in a couple years, if there were unforeseen money that came in through whatever source, then council could vote to defer a rate increase, as happened during COVID. Council did hold off for a year on implementing a planned rate increase that was adopted as part of the last rate study. So the same thing could happen.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And then I have two more questions specifically related to commercial customers, because we haven't talked too much about them. I realize some of this analysis was of commercial customers' use during the pandemic, and I know in the analysis it speaks to that use has been reduced. Is there some concern that that this could be? for sure, a hardship, but could prevent commercial customers from returning to normal use. Maybe that's too subjective.
Yeah, I don't know that I could venture a guess on that one, but that is definitely one of the factors that was taken into consideration as part of this rate study was what assumptions can we make about how long it might take for that commercial consumption to get back to where it was pre-pandemic. And unfortunately, we don't have a good go-by here. We just have to kind of make an educated guess and a safe assumption on behalf of the utility.
Great. And then last question related to commercial customers and question in general is, I realize it would, probably be only the larger commercial customers, but could then, if they created pretreatment systems, I imagine that could reduce their rates. Would that be true?
Yeah, absolutely. The city partnered with Pacific Seafood to construct a pretreatment system at a city-owned facility leased by Pacific Seafood, and that customer, which is one of the most significant in the system, was able to reduce the strength of their effluent, thereby going to a different classification and significantly reducing their bill. So it's a business decision. Do we fund pretreatment, which is a big upfront cost, and then lower our bill over time? How long do you think you're going to be at the facility? Those kinds of things are what weigh in that decision.
Councilmember Bauer.
Director Gerving, I don't know if Ms. Taylor actually mentioned this or alluded to or discussed the age of the sewer plant. When was that built?
So the plant was built in the very end of the 70s, early 80s. It was commissioned in the early 80s. So it's been in service for effectively 40 years. And it continues to age. Thankfully, a lot of the structural components, large concrete structures, are for the most part still in good shape. That's not universally true, and there are some upgrades necessary there. But you continue to see an ongoing need to upgrade electrical components, mechanical components, that just because of the nature of the environment, both a wastewater plant and even more so a wastewater plant that's so close to Humboldt Bay and the salt air and the wind and the rain and everything else, it's harsh on equipment. So the needs are great. You add to that then changing regulations, changing interpretations of regulations, and the consent decree, and it's a recipe for a huge need from a capital expenditure standpoint.
And the typical lifespan of a sewer plant, what do you think it is?
Well, you would typically plan for an economic life of 30 years. Concrete structures and that sort of thing might have a planned lifespan of about 50 years. We hope to get a lot more than that through good maintenance and a lot of proactive work, but it's something where we are now basically over time continuing to upgrade and maintain that plant so that we don't have to replace it, because that would be an expenditure that the customers would not be able to accommodate.
And along those lines too, the sewer line system, I know we're way past the lifespan. Was it roughly started 100 years ago?
A little more than that. We've got a map that has a color-coded estimate. It's not line by line, but an estimate of what portions of the system were constructed during what decades. And the majority of the city system is over 100 years old. And it's comprised of vitrified clay pipe, short pieces of, basically sort of a terracotta material, and just does not, it's robust, it's good in certain circumstances, but in our shifting soils with expansive soils and groundwater, over time, it gets out of alignment, it gets crushed, it gets root intrusion, and those are the kinds of lines that need a ton of work. And when you're talking about 120 miles of pipe, the majority of it over 100 years old, it's a major burden on the customers and on the utility.
And the water delivery system, pretty old too, right?
The water delivery system, not quite as old as the sewer system, but still very old. A lot of it, the portions of the system that we have the most problems with, just because of the nature of the material and how it also fares in those shifting soil conditions is AC pipe or asbestos cement pipe. It can get brittle and it gets out of alignment, and you have a small pinhole leak that turns into a big failure. That's what happened in November down on 3rd Street, and on a Sunday morning, a good portion of the city woke up to pretty low water pressure, and it was due to one leak in one pipe on 3rd Street. But that one pipe is representative of, again, the majority of the city's system that's the same configuration of the same age.
And I ask these questions because I mean, people are wondering why the substantial increase, right? And it's pretty clear that we have really aging infrastructure that's critical to businesses, to our citizens. And have there been rate increases over the past, let's say, 30, 40 years that we could have lessened this burden, knowing that we have, even 30 years ago, it was still a 70-year-old sewer system? I want to understand why councils haven't addressed this in the past and leave us with this huge burden, if I may.
That's a really good question. I can't answer on their behalf. What I can say is that these decisions are never easy. Staff acknowledges the impact that rate increases like this have on our customers. We are thankful that the increases are not as significant as the ones from 5 years ago, but we absolutely acknowledge that this rate study and the one from 2017 are both a lot more significant than anything that came before. And, we also acknowledge that it takes council prioritizing this infrastructure and ensuring that it's going to be in good condition and continue to serve our customers for the decades to come, that makes that necessary.
Thank you.
Mayor Seaman?
Again, following up on Councilmember Castellano's question, you were mentioning that businesses may be able to invest in their own facilities in order to bring their rates down, and those investments would be pretty significant. And while we haven't seen a lot of grants for the city to make improvements, there are EDA, USDA infrastructure, maybe some CDBG opportunities for those businesses. Do we have any capacity in-house to help support them if they're applying for those grants so that they can make those improvements, lessening their impact and maybe helping to not affect their rate so much?
Well, of those, and good evening, Mayor and Council. Of those programs, the CDBG is the one that we're most familiar with. And if there was an avenue to help our businesses through that process, we could. I think EDA would be difficult if it could only if it's justified as maintaining those jobs, and if it didn't happen, those jobs wouldn't be maintained. So that one could be difficult. But from a CDBG perspective, there is a possibility for that, and we do have staff expertise on CDBG grants if those opportunities should arise.
Thank you. Good to see you. You were hiding behind Autumn, and I thought you weren't there tonight.
Any further questions? Councilmember Castellano?
I was just thinking, I just wanted to make sure I understood something properly. So what we vote on tonight is the maximum that we can increase the rates over the next 5 years, and according to the rate study and what we anticipate increasing them, or how we anticipate increasing them. And so, sorry, I'm just trying to play out a hypothetical situation. So let's say next year or in 2 years, in the general fund, we had a budget surplus. At that point, council could decide to put some of that towards and decided to put some of that towards the water sewer CIP, capital improvement plan. Then at that time, council could decide to not increase the rates as much, or to kind of curtail the rate increase.
Right. Each year, the council adopts a fee schedule that includes charges for services across all the city's operations, and water and sewer charges are one part of that. So that increase could be held off or, completely eliminated.
Perfect.
And I'll add to that there's also a possibility to supplement utility assistance programs or something of the like to allow for people to get grant funding if there is a surplus like that.
Great. And then just to follow up on that, we did offer, during the pandemic, we did offer a utility assistance program.
We actually used CDBG money for that.
And it was used, but there was actually still money remaining in that program as well. So
yeah, and unfortunately, we've tried to work with CDBG to reallocate that funding for something that would be more useful to our community members, because we do have a significant amount of funding still left from that program that wasn't utilized by the community.
Councilmember Moulton.
You say it wasn't used. Does that mean it's going away, or it sits there waiting to be used?
It's still there. It's just specific to COVID. And so the parameters need to be met that they have a hardship because of COVID, and that's why they need to use that funding. And so if there's anybody out there and they do have a hardship because of COVID and they're having a hard time paying their utility bills, we have funding available for them. But there is still a significant amount left that hasn't been used.
And there was also a program through the state for both water and wastewater that basically covered the past due balances for a large number of customers in each utility to the tune of a couple $300,000 for each water and sewer during the pandemic that was, again, funded by the state and helped to ease that burden on folks who couldn't pay at that time.
Any further questions? Well, now I have one. So Councilmember Castellano had brought forward this idea, you had brought forward this idea that we are at the maximum rate. So could that be manipulated, or are we standing at the high rate?
So what I meant is, from a legal standpoint, from a Prop 218 standpoint, the rate study says this is the cost of providing these services to fund these capital expenditures for the operations and maintenance of both the water and the sewer systems. So that is the maximum increase that the council could enact. You can't go higher than that. Mm-hmm. However, staff is not recommending a lower number than that because, like the rate study demonstrates, those are the funds necessary to operate the system and to fund those capital expenditures. So yes, from a legal standpoint, council could go with a lower amount, but no, staff is not recommending it.
Thank you for clarifying. Okay, with no further questions, just look good. Okay, we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Is there anyone here to comment on this item? Anyone from the public?
Hi there. I'm Pat. I'm sure you remember me from last time. Councilmember Bauer, the last question you asked was very, very telling in that you said, why all of a sudden are we getting this rate increase? And it's also very telling that they really couldn't give you an answer to that. That's one. Two is what you said. What if we vote no? Well, basically what they're saying is you can't vote no. That's another point I want to make. Doesn't sound right to me at all. Thirdly, last time I was here, I'm sorry, I worked last night and I slept 4 hours, so I'm like, last time I was here, I said, somebody think outside the box, and I guess nobody did. I looked up the city of LA. They made a regulation, or they're getting tax revenue. It's called the wealthy mansion tax for the homeless. I don't know how they got around Prop 13, but they did. And I was just thinking, you're our elected people. You're supposed to help us. Could you please look into something else as far as these rate increases are concerned? And like I said, they don't, why all of a sudden now? And you can't say no. So please help the people who elected you. Thank you. I gotta go to sleep.
Thanks, Pat. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to comment?
I just have a question about, for Jordan. In your estimate of how much sewer rates would go up, did you take into account the rescinding of the 2 free units of sewer?
So we don't do questions and answers during public comment, but the council can certainly get answers
That was
for you.
one of my questions. And it just seems like it's a double whammy. I mean, not only are we getting increases for water and sewer, but those 2 units, which represent a heck of a lot of water. A unit is 748 gallons. Those are, you're going to be paying for that from the get-go. And I think that either doing one or the other is good. One of the things that Jordan said was they looked at those 2 free units, and she said they couldn't justify why those had been given with the monthly flat rate fee for the sewer. And I just think that's kind of that's a non-answer. You know, they couldn't justify why. So they were rescinding it. I just think it bears some looking into. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, council and mayors. I'm Kelly Martin from Eureka. My first question is about the size of the meter going into the property. I didn't really get to talk to anybody about it thoroughly yet, but I was interested in the reason why, if you have a 1.5-inch meter going into your home, and the neighbor has a 1/2-inch meter going into his home, and you're only one person, why would be paying that huge expense for a bigger meter? And especially if the meter coming to the line, supply line coming from the lateral in the street is the same size. That means that I know a house I worked on years ago over on O Street. He had an 1.5-inch meter, and that was like 30 years ago. But he had a lot of animals on his property. It was a large estate, but the there's only one person living in that house now. That's 30 years ago. But why would be paying for the size of the meter? It'd be like if you live in an older house in Eureka, you probably have a 100-amp service going to your home. If you have a newer, larger home, you'll probably have a 200-amp service, but you pay your kilowatts for what you use. So I'm kind of I don't think that's fair to be charging people, residential or commercial buildings. I mean, because commercial people use the same amount of water, but the meter might be bigger. So that's one of my questions. I think this is a great evening. Know that I really appreciate all your interesting questions and your presentation. It was actually was a lot nicely to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay. Anyone else out there want to come public comment? All right, seeing none, are there any public commenters on Zoom? No. Okay, with that, we'll bring it back to council we're going to close the public hearing, and then we'll bring it back to council for comments or questions or a motion. Councilmember Arroyo.
I was hoping staff or Jordan Taylor could clarify the 2 free units and the change from that to what we're currently hearing tonight, and just the intent of saying that it couldn't be justified. What I heard in that was maybe that it couldn't be justified via Prop 218, and that it's like fair and equitable and you're paying for the service you're getting. But I don't know if that was actually what was meant.
That's exactly what was meant.
Okay.
We have to make sure that the charges are fair and equitable based on the customer's impact on the system, what they're using in water, in the case of those 2 free units, what they're putting down the drain and sending to the treatment plant. The historic thought behind the 2 free units was to assign some number to what gets used potentially in cooking, potentially in irrigation. Both of those numbers are going to be, in the case of cooking, it's a really insignificant quantity. In the case of irrigation, it's going to be very hugely variable among our residential customers and commercial ones too. So because of that variability, there wasn't a justifiable way of saying 2 free units is a good estimate. And in actuality, the more equitable way to do it is to make sure that everyone's charged based on what they're consuming.
Okay, thank you. And may I ask one more? Or just to the other public commenters, comment or question around the smaller kind of meter or service size. Yeah, I wonder if you could speak to that, but then I also wonder if we could consider offering perhaps a lower cost or free opportunity to downgrade if people want to change their service size. So kind of like the pre-treatment, if you want to invest up front to lower your costs later, could we do something to make that easier for people?
So we do already offer that opportunity. If people are, if you've got a single family residence, it's got a 1.5 inch or a 1 inch meter and it's just a regular house, then oftentimes we do just switch those meters out, especially if the old meter is old and beyond its useful life. It might be in need of replacement anyway. Sometimes the city will do that at no charge. In the case of a commercial customer, or in the case of a newer home with fire sprinklers, there's a little bit more work that needs to be done to verify that it's safe to use a smaller meter, but we still support customers in doing that. And if they've got a meter that is newer and they do need to purchase a new meter, we will give them a credit for the value of their old meter. So we already do that. When it comes to why does a larger meter pay more in their base rate, even though they're consuming the same amount of water, that's because of the amount of water that meter could put through. And that gets back to some of the capacity related charges that Ms. Taylor covered in her presentation. And any more detail beyond that, I'd kind of want to hand it back to her if you'd like more detail.
But someone could conceivably say, oh, wow, this is a high base rate. I'd like to go smaller. And then we would, that would be at no charge. I mean, obviously changing the infrastructure would come at some charge, but we wouldn't charge them a permit fee, for example, or to do so.
Just give us a call in Public Works and we'll look and see if it's feasible and help you through the process.
Okay, thanks.
Any further comments or questions, or do we have a motion? Councilmember Bauer? Of the motion? Yes. I think this is it. Oh, no, here it is. No, here it is. Sorry. We have it here.
Oh, it sounds like you're thinking about it. I'd be happy to make another comment if you want.
No, please.
A couple of minutes.
Please.
I just, I think it's an important point that was raised about us kicking the can down the road. And, 5 years ago, I was here in the same position, looking at how much deferred maintenance we had. And then we were sued, and we really needed to expedite the improvement of these systems, in part because of that, but in part because we acknowledge that these are all systems that haven't had the infrastructure improvement that they need. And so it's terrible to sit in this position. This is an awful last meeting, actually. Because this is one of the things that nobody wants to do. I do support the increase because I think we have to pay for it now, or we'll have catastrophic failure later. So I think I see it as something that is essential maintenance, and there's no legal and fair way to charge people in a different configuration, I believe, and we could subsidize some of those costs on an annual basis if we have the money. And so I think that provides us the flexibility that we need to make that kind of decision. But I think it's a fair point of saying, why, like, nobody knows why people made the political decisions they made in the past. Nobody here knows why, the first time it came to me, I voted to do the very unpopular thing and increase rates. So I can't speak for past political leaders and why they would have chosen not to charge more. But it falls upon us to decide what to do. So in my mind, I don't know that there's any answer besides maintaining the system so that people can flush their toilets and get drinking water. So I think those are essential utilities that we must support. So do I have to read the whole motion, or can I move staff recommendation? I move staff recommendation, and I will say with the hope that costs don't have to be that high each year.
And I'll second. I just want to make a comment on that. I mean, there is no good alternative. Look at Flint. I forget the city in Pennsylvania. Every time you see somebody having to face a big decision, we're talking, typically it's millions of dollars in infrastructure improvements because nobody did anything for decades. In those cases, they privatized their systems, and it leads to catastrophic, the outcome is catastrophic for the community, whether it be lead in their water or their rates quadrupling. And that's a fact. You can look those up. There's many instances of cities privatizing their water and sewer, and we're not doing that. Not in this town, because this is still going to be cheaper than the alternative, and we're not doing privatization. So it's a bummer that the can has been kicked for decades. I feel like it has, but like Councilmember Arroyo said, essentially water is life, and sewer systems are critical to not having things like cholera and all these horrible diseases that struck cities, centuries ago. We're past that, and we have really old infrastructure that needs to be upgraded, and it's unfortunate that we all have to bear the burden of that. But I don't see any alternative, so I think I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. Are we ready to vote? Councilmember Castellano?
I definitely, agree with the concerns and sentiments of my fellow council members. I do want to ask that, it sounds like, so minimal, there are some resources available to businesses and maybe, I guess I just want to ask staff to keep researching, if there's grants available for businesses, if there is support in the future for residential customers, et cetera, and make sure that we include that in the bills that we send out, along with, I do think it'd be great to have, a workshop or something if we find resources so that people can access them, because, I definitely, want to make sure that we, that we can do some work to, find resources and make sure that people can use them and get the support they need.
Any further comments? Councilmember Arroyo?
Autumn might glare at me, but I'm going to say that you will have the option just a few short weeks to decide whether to do a more expansive utility assistance program, which could serve as a model for future utility assistance programs. So I think that's there's a lot of heartache in these kinds of decisions, but there might be a good alternative waiting in the wings in the near future. So I'm excited to see that, at least as a way to hopefully help some people.
And thank you for that. Okay, any further comments? Seeing none, please vote.
Unanimous yes vote, motion carries.
Thank you. And with that, thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate you coming and sharing with us this evening. We're adjourned until tomorrow, 6 p.m. for our next adventure. Good night.